Good to be with you again. We're in Daniel chapter 5 today, and hopefully you've enjoyed our study up to this point. We're getting right into the text of Daniel chapter 5, and as we pointed out last time, King Nebuchadnezzar is out of the picture at this point. His name will pop up here a little bit in chapter 5, but he's out of the picture. We're into a new section of the Babylonian kingdom, and that is the section where Belshazzar is king. It looks like to me, and there's been some amount of question as to whether or not Belshazzar was actually even king. The liberal critical scholars raise this sort of question. Let me demonstrate what's happening here. Let's see if I can pull this other thing up just a moment. Okay, yes, here we go. Belshazzar, I think, is a sub-king to his father, Nabonidus. Nabonidus is his father, who started the reign a little bit earlier. His son, then, Belshazzar, is the king underneath him. This is not unusual by any means. The same kind of thing, it seems to me, happens in the Old Testament, where you have Uzziah and Jotham and Ahaz and Hezekiah. And it looks like each of those kings reign still for a time while their son comes onto the throne as well. It's called co-regency, a co-reign, co-regency. And the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is, first of all, I think it explains Belshazzar's relation to Nabonidus, and I think that's a good answer to the liberal critical scholars. The fact that this is easily documented in the Old Testament literature and history demonstrates that this is at the least, it's a possibility. It's a real possibility. But the second reason I'm bringing this to your attention is because later on in the text we're going to run into this fellow named Darius. And it might just be the case that he's actually involved in something like a co-regency also. Darius in 5:30 and 31, Daniel chapter 5:30 and 31. So I think the liberal critical scholars need to reckon with that. Belshazzar is co-regent to his father Nabonidus. There's one more point I'll bring out here. Look at 5:7 if you're in Daniel 5 and verse 7. It says that he would make a certain fellow, this is the end of 5:7, we'll explain the narrative here in just a moment, but at the end of 5:7 he says that he'll make somebody of an authority position or figure as third ruler in the kingdom. And then if you drop down to 5:16, again he promises to make somebody a third ruler in the kingdom. I wonder why Belshazzar promises the third position in the kingdom rather than the second position. Maybe because he's already in the second position and he's just under his father, Nabonidus, the present Babylonian king. I think that's highly possible. And in fact, there's some archaeological data, some historical data that would suggest that his father Nabonidus was out of town, out of the province of Babylon at this time. You can see that documented in the commentary that I've been referring to this whole series, the book that I've got out on Daniel. I give you a little more information about Belshazzar's, or Nabonidus's rather, being out of town. Okay, well, let's get into 5:1. Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles. He was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. And it says when Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold, silver vessels, which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. And so in verse 3, then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Okay, what you've got here is, first of all, with Belshazzar, you've got a father-son arrangement in the co-regency. And even if Belshazzar were not an actual biological son, that's not a problem. It could have been that Nabopolassar was nothing more than a guardian. It could have been that he was adopted. All of that's at least a possibility. There are other explanations as to how the word son is used, and Robert Dick Wilson documents, I think it was something like 20 or 22 different ways in which the word son is used in the Old Testament. So it's used a number of ways. Easily could be the case that Belshazzar is a son not only of Nabonidus, but a son, a grandson, could just mean descendant as it's used in Matthew 1:1, a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, as the text goes on, he's going to try to link himself to Nebuchadnezzar. This is 5 verse 11, where it said, King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners, speaking of Daniel's appointment by Nebuchadnezzar. The queen mother at that point is going to call Nebuchadnezzar Belshazzar's father. I don't think anybody thinks that he was an immediate son, biological son that is, to Nebuchadnezzar, but the word son has a number of different usages, and one of those is easily understood to mean descendant. So Belshazzar is a legitimate descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, maybe even if he's a grandson or perhaps even a great-grandson. Now this is 5 in verse 2. It says Belshazzar tasted the wine. Well, did you read 5:1-4 with me? Did you get the idea that's what's going on here? This is something like a pagan, idolatrous party, don't you think? They've got the vessels that were out of the temple, out of Solomon's temple there in Babylon. And it's almost as if Belshazzar, in order to demonstrate his own ability and his own greatness, smacks God in the face and says, well, I'll even use these vessels. Now, there was nothing sacred about these vessels. Keep this in mind. There was nothing sacred of the vessels, in and of the vessels themselves, that is. There was nothing sacred about the container, but they were sacred in that the action went deeper than just the vessel. It was a smack at God. It was a smack at God. There's nothing sacred about the gold or the silver that was in the temple. Nothing sacred about that. But it was the deeper problem that went to God and smacked him in the face that really got God going. And that's what Belshazzar's doing. It's the attitude that's the problem here. It's the attitude and the actions that come with it. It's not that he eroded some kind of sacred element that God had in the temple. The fact of the matter is that the problem goes to his attitude and the atrocious actions that he's engaged in. Now, the word tasted in 5:2, I'm told, could have the indication of even under the influence. Belshazzar was under the influence of the alcoholic wine. Maybe that's the case. Not quite sure, but maybe that's so. And it says that he had done all of this with his nobles, his wives, his concubines, and all of them were involved in this pagan party. It doesn't take but a step from where we are already to imagine even worse things happening at this party, don't you think? But in Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar is not the kind of fellow that we would expect anything different from, would we? He's a pagan king. He's not even been familiar with Daniel, we're going to find out. His influence from the pagan Babylonians and his influence back upon them has not been anything that would honor God. Well, the Babylonian Chronicles date this event as taking place in 539, October 12th of 539 BC. That could be possible. Tough to say with any real certainty, but the Babylonian Chronicles would have been their historical records, and maybe there's something to that. Now, as we think about 2 Kings 24 and 25, all of that just gives the detail as to how the things in the temple ever left Palestine to begin with. Let me demonstrate on a map just what this might look like. If we were looking at a map, this is the Mediterranean Sea. And then you have Jerusalem somewhere right here. This would mean that the Dead Sea and the Jordan River up to the Sea of Galilee. This is the Sea of Galilee. This is the Dead Sea. This is the Jordan River. That's where we are geographically. Egypt is a good reference point. It's down here towards the south. Now, Babylon is situated between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, which cuts out, these rivers combine over here and cut over into the Gulf of Persia. Babylon is about right here. And this is where Daniel has been taken, Babylon, and this is where Belshazzar presently is reigning. Quite a ways from Jerusalem, but back in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had invaded, taken all of the things out of Jerusalem, out of the temple that is, the gold, the silver, the vessels, etc., and he drugged them back to Babylon. So you can imagine why Belshazzar's wanting to use these vessels and demonstrate exactly why he has no respect for Yahweh, Jehovah, the God of Israel's covenant. Why do you think he would be that disrespectful? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, he doesn't believe in God. But then second, by doing this sort of thing, he links himself to Nebuchadnezzar, this innovator in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was the one who made things happen for Babylon, made them a world power. And so by doing all of this, he links himself to his probably grandfather. Now, this is 5:5. So while this party is happening, this gathering, this pagan gathering, Suddenly the fingers of a man's hand, verse 5, emerged, and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. And then the king's face, Belshazzar's face, grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him. His hip joints went slack, his knees began knocking together. And it says in 5:7, the king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Again, the fact that he tells him you can be third ruler in the kingdom, whoever can interpret this writing on the wall, says something about him being the second in command, don't you think? This is 5:8. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. And then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. We've already seen this a time or two in Daniel, haven't we? In Daniel 2, the wise men, the astrologers, etc., are unable to work with Nebuchadnezzar. Same thing in chapter 4. He calls them in, and they're unable to work. And then Daniel steps in both cases and works wonders by the power of God. Here we are in chapter 5, and it says in 5:8, all the king's wise men once again came in, and they couldn't read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Where's Daniel in all of this? Maybe after the change of powers, after it had gone from Nebuchadnezzar to another king, and finally to Nabonidus and then Belshazzar, maybe in this transition of kings, these wise men finally got what they wanted and got Daniel out of the way. But the interesting thing is, once again, we're seeing their inability. So maybe they're just on a power trip and they just want to be the men in a healthy corner of the king's court. But whatever the case may be, they're unable to do what the king needs them to do. Daniel, on the other hand, will demonstrate once again that God has this sort of power. And because of that, Daniel has been enabled in order to work wonders for God in a distant foreign land. This is 5:10. So the queen entered the banquet hall. Because of the words of the king and his nobles, the queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. I'll read through verse 12. It says in verse 11, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Still the same fella, Daniel, Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. Who is this queen? Can't quite say for sure. Josephus and Herodotus might help us identify her as Nitocris. Let's just go ahead and throw that spelling up here so you can see. Nitocris. Maybe that's true. There was this female in the Babylonian history. Maybe that's who it is. Tough to say. I don't think it's the king's wife, you see. I don't think it's the king's wife. I don't think it's Belshazzar's wife. It said in chapter 5 and verse 2 that his wives and his concubines were already at the party. So in chapter 5 and verse 10, when the queen enters the banquet hall, I don't think she's one of the wives of Belshazzar. There's another text, and this is in Jeremiah, where it talks about a queen mother of the Egyptians. There was a queen mother, and this is a cultural phenomenon in that day, where maybe Belshazzar's mama is the one that's in view, something like that. Maybe even it wasn't his biological mother, but maybe a stepmother sort of figure who was maybe even married to Nabonidus, his father. And we've talked enough about the word son and how it could even just mean descendant or heir or adopted son. Loads of possibilities here. Tough to say with any real absoluteness, I suppose. And then at 5:12, again 5:11 and 5:12, it insists that Nebuchadnezzar, the father, the great monarch of Babylon, he had done wonderful things for Babylon. It looks like this whole episode is Belshazzar's way of trying to make a name for himself as he links himself to his father, Nebuchadnezzar. This is 5:13 then, Daniel 5:13. Finally, after the queen mother's suggestion is made, it says in 5:13, Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke, said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you that a spirit of the gods," polytheist of course, "is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you." Let's hold there for just a moment. Look at 5:11 again. The queen mother says to Belshazzar, "There's a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods." A spirit of the holy gods. Maybe she is still polytheist. I mean, she says gods plural. But why does she call them the holy gods? Can't quite say. Maybe she knows a little bit more. She obviously knows who Daniel is. Maybe she knows a little bit more about Daniel's God than we get right here in the text. But it's interesting, while she says there's a man, Daniel, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, it says in 5:14, Belshazzar says, "I've heard about you, Daniel, that a spirit of the gods is in you." Not the holy gods. Maybe that's intentional. Maybe not. But whatever the case, we know something about Jehovah God in the Old Testament, and it says in Exodus 15:11, it says in Exodus 34:6 and 7, that this God that we serve, Jehovah God, is a holy God, a holy God. His loving purpose to redeem humanity is always embedded within his character. There's a difference between Jehovah God and the gods of polytheism in Babylon. So, maybe Belshazzar intentionally drops that word holy out. Maybe he doesn't have a care for holiness. But whatever we learn from all of this, we know that our God is holy. And 1 Peter 1:15 and 16 says something like this: "Be ye holy, for I am holy." And so we need to work on our holiness to try to grow closer to God and have our spirits develop just more as he is, more like he is. This is 5:15 then. So he says, Belshazzar says, "Just now the wise men, the conjurers, were brought in before me that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you'll be clothed with purple, wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you'll have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom." So, the promise of being the third in command again is given, probably suggesting that Nabonidus is the primary king, Belshazzar is the co-regent, and then you've got Daniel being promised the third position in the kingdom. Now, that's all going to get interesting because, catch this, in 5:17, finally Daniel starts to speak. "And Daniel said before the king, 'Keep your gifts for yourself or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him.'" You might remember with Gehazi in 2 Kings 5, Naaman gets cured. Elisha is the one who cures Naaman through the dipping in the Jordan River 7 times. He's the one who gives the word from God. Of course, God's the one who healed him. But then finally Naaman catches up and wants to give him some kind of trinket for working this wonderful thing. And Elisha says, "No, I won't have it." Gehazi takes it. Guess what happens to him? He gets smitten with leprosy. So, that demands a much more deeper discussion. That demands a longer discussion, doesn't it? As to whether or not you can take payment for your, spiritual service, we might say. Gehazi's heart's wrong. Easy enough to see if you read that narrative, 2 Kings 5. Daniel's nothing of the sort, but he's also going to give us a little bit more of an explanation here as to why Daniel doesn't care anything about the third position in the kingdom. Daniel's going to tell us why there's a second reason as to why that is. This is verse 18. "O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father." Well, that sounds right. Daniel reminds Belshazzar of Nebuchadnezzar's greatness. But, catch this in 19. "Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished he killed, whomever he wished he spared alive, and whomever he wished he elevated, and whomever he wished he humbled." But in verse 20, this is where you can imagine Belshazzar's smile, Daniel's reminding him of the greatness of Babylon and the greatness of Nebuchadnezzar, his granddaddy. But then we get into 5:20, and all of a sudden you can imagine Belshazzar's face sinking again, and that feeling in his stomach knotting up. And he says in 5:20, "But when Nebuchadnezzar's heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne and his glory was taken away from him." Maybe at this point Belshazzar's starting to get what Daniel Belteshazzar is all about. He's not just here to play the political games and to seek out the third position in the kingdom. Daniel is only concerned with truth. And so in 5 and verse 21, he reminds Belshazzar, Daniel does, he was driven away from mankind. His heart was made like that of the beasts. His dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Oh, we just want to hear about Nebuchadnezzar's greatness. We don't want to hear anything about how he was made great by God, how he was allowed to be great by God, how God humbled him in order to exalt him. James 4:10 reminds us of something like that. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and then he'll lift you up. You want to be great in God's sight? Start with practicing humility and see where God takes you then. This is 5:22 of Daniel. Yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all of this. It's a tough lesson to learn when we don't learn from the lessons of others, right? Look, we need to read Daniel 4, like I said in our last segment. We need to read Daniel 4 and learn how to learn lessons without learning them the hard way. Nebuchadnezzar had to go through a period of abasement, humility, in order to recognize who he was and where he was in relation to Jehovah God. You don't be like that. Don't be like that. Be like the kind of fella who learns from Nebuchadnezzar's mistakes and develops a kind of relationship with God before it's too late, before we have to learn it the hard way. We said enough about that in the last segment, didn't we? This is 5:23. But you, Belshazzar, have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. They've brought the vessels of the house before you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines have been drinking wine from them. You've praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, stone, which you do not even see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hand are your life, breath, and your ways, you have not glorified. I don't really think that Belshazzar had a whole lot of stock in the pagan gods either. That was probably a political affair, don't you think? He had to just go along with the politics at the Babylonian camp. That's what I'd think. Maybe he really did believe. But it's interesting that Daniel gives us this remark at the end of 5:23. The God in whose hand are your life, breath, and all your ways, you've not glorified. You can't see, hear, or understand the idols. You bow down to them. The God who's granted you life, you don't even honor a bit. This is 5:24. Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was sent out. Now check this out in 5:25. The inscription that was written out read this way: Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Wonder what that means. And I wonder why these fellows couldn't understand what it was when it appeared on the wall. Let me give you a couple of possibilities here. There are a couple of things to recognize about this line. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. What are we to make out of all of that? Well, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. The first one is this. The Aramaic language reads from right to left. The Aramaic language reads from right to left. And, better yet, no vowels. Imagine that mess. Imagine having to read a language right to left, no vowels. Maybe it is Aramaic. Some of these words, they're called loan words, L-O-A-N words, loan words, or when words are taken from another language and they're borrowed by a new language. So, for instance, like we argued in Daniel chapter 3, you've got 3 Greek words, but musical words are extremely slippery, and they kind of slip into other languages very easily. It doesn't matter if it's a French or a Latin word. It's easily picked up into even the English language. You see this kind of thing, don't you? Okay, it could be that it's ancient Sumerian. The language could be ancient Sumerian. Now, where Daniel might have learned ancient Sumerian, can't quite say. But then again, he's got God on his side. Maybe he didn't learn the language at all. Maybe God just goes ahead and develops this kind of thing with him. Or then maybe even this particular inscription, Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, could have been unintelligible, not understandable, because it was corrupted somehow. Maybe the text that was written on the wall wasn't so clear, and maybe if they had these kinds of struggles because of the Aramaic language or it's ancient Sumerian, maybe some of these wise men couldn't understand it because it was also difficult because of how corrupted the text may have been. It was written on a wall, etched on the side of the wall. Was it legible? I don't know. I don't know why they couldn't read the thing. But to say that it's just some mystical God language that God had to then reveal to Daniel, I don't think is exhaustive. These are some possibilities as to what's going on here. Now let's go back and talk about this then. 525, you've got this interesting line. What does it mean? Well, interestingly enough, even if it wasn't fully in Aramaic, some of these words are words about weights and measurements. So why is God giving 4 words, Aramaic words, about weights and measurements? Well, let's take a look at the inscription and its interpretation. In 526, Daniel interprets meaning as God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. So it has to do with numbering, weights, making a judgment, making a measurement. He has numbered the kingdom and put an end to it. That's what Daniel interprets the word meaning as. He knows the Aramaic word, perhaps. Let's say that. And Daniel knows how that's used even in some other places in the Old Testament, like Samuel, 1 Samuel 2:3, or in Job 31. It's used that way. But even if Daniel knows that, he says this: God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. In this present application, the hands writing on the wall gives us a term that's used about weight or measurement, but it's being applied to the measurement of the Babylonian kingdom. God's numbered this kingdom. It's been put to an end. Now there's something interesting about this phrase here in 526. 526 gives us this phrase, put to an end. Maybe your translation reads a little bit differently there on 526. But you have this word in Aramaic that gets picked up by Jeremiah. It's not really picked up by Jeremiah. Jeremiah used it, and we've already pointed out, this is Daniel 9 and verses 1 and 2. We know that Daniel is familiar with Jeremiah, right? We know that Daniel's already reading Jeremiah's text. Well, what does Jeremiah have to say? He talks about the destruction of the Davidic monarchy under people like Josiah and Shallum and Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim and Zedekiah and Coniah. I think Shallum is actually another name for one of those fellows, Jehoahaz. But Jeremiah's talked about the fall of the Davidic monarchy. But he also talks something about the judgment that God will later bring even upon Babylon. Babylon is God's tool to punish the wicked in Israel. But then he's going to bring another tool, the Medes and the Persians, to punish the wicked in Babylon. God uses empires this way. And that's what Daniel's text is all about saying. But Jeremiah has the same kind of word put to an end, same word in his text. And it's something like this. Let's put it right over here. The word is repay. Jeremiah's word is the word repay. Same word. It comes from the same root. The Aramaic phrase here that we've got, put to an end, is the same in Jeremiah's text as translated in the English, repay. Let's get some of these passages. This is Jeremiah 25 and verse 14. And then we'll look at a couple more. This is Jeremiah 50, 29. And then also Jeremiah 51, 6. And then 24 and 56. Let's look at some of these passages in Jeremiah, and I'll call our attention to something else that's very interesting here. In Jeremiah 25, in verse 14, it says this: many nations and great kings will make slaves of them, even them, and I will recompense or repay them according to their deeds and according to the work of their hands. God's going to repay or put to an end. Who is it? The Babylonians. In Jeremiah's context, it is the Babylonians. He gets more specific for us. This is chapter 50 and verse 29. Look at this in Jeremiah 50, verse 29. Summon many against Babylon. In Jeremiah 50 and 51, we have an oracle devoted exclusively to the fall of Babylon. Jeremiah's phasing out as a prophet. This is going to be the end of his text, the end of his book. And so he gives us a number of chapters here at the end of Jeremiah where he pronounces judgment against the nations, as is customary for the prophets. And so, we'll take a look at this. If you're in 47, it's against Philistia. 48 is against Moab. 49 is against Ammon. Chapter 49, verse 7 starts it against Edom. 49 verse 23 is against Damascus. You've got one in 28 against Kedar and Hazor. You've got one in 49:34 against Elam. The longest one is this, 50 and 51, both are an extended oracle against Babylon. Jeremiah gives us an extended oracle against Babylon, and Daniel knows and reads Jeremiah. So catch this in Jeremiah 50 and verse 29. Jeremiah 50:29, in this oracle against Babylon, it says this, summon many against Babylon, all those who bend the bow, encamp against her on every side, let there be no escape. Repay her according to her work. Repay. Same word that Daniel sees here, mene, in Daniel 5. Same word here in Jeremiah 50, verse 29. Repay her according to her work, according to all she's done. So do to her. She's become arrogant against the Lord, against the Holy One of Israel. Then this is chapter 51, and this gets really good. This is 51:6. 51:6, you've got the word again. The Lord is going to render recompense, repay her. This is 51:24 of Jeremiah, 51:24. I will repay Babylon and all the inhabitants of Chaldea for their evil. He'll repay them. And then 51:56, look at this. 51:56, once more. The destroyer is coming against her, against Babylon. Her mighty men will be captured. Their bows are shattered. The Lord is a God of recompense, repaying. He will fully repay. Now, while you're there in Jeremiah, there's one more text we want to get that doesn't use the word repay, but it's going to help us see how Daniel was impacted even by Jeremiah's text. This is Jeremiah 51 and verse 11. We're still in that unit. 50 and 51 of Jeremiah is that oracle against Babylon. And look at this in 51:11. Sharpen the arrows, fill the quivers. The Lord has aroused the spirit of the king of the Medes, because his purpose is against Babylon to destroy it. 51:11 of Jeremiah says that the Medes will come in and conquer Babylon. What do you think he's talking about? What do you think Daniel's picking up on? If Daniel knows Jeremiah, and he does, as demonstrated in Daniel 9:1 and 2, then it's not hard to see that it's not much of a step, not much of a stretch at all, to see this in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 26, that this word here that's an Aramaic loan word, God's numbered your kingdom and put an end to it, he's going to repay. Daniel's possibly and probably influenced by Jeremiah's oracles, and he sees all of this developing a little bit later from Jeremiah in his own day. This is 5:27. You've got this word, tekel. You've been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Well, there again we see the weighing and the measurement kind of connotation there. Tekel. In reference, this word's been dropped in context to the Babylonian kingdom. The kingdom of Babylon's been weighed and found deficient, found lacking, found wanting. This is 5:28. And then we have this word, Perez. And you say, hold on. That's not how the inscription read. It didn't go like this. Wasn't it the word mene tekel upharsin? So what are we doing to make the transposition to the word Perez? I guess that's an S. How do we make that jump? Does this sound like anything to you? Well, I think so. It sounds like the word Persian. That's what Daniel means. He is using wordplay. And what he does is he shifts the inscription on the wall and makes it read something like this. And look at how he interprets it then. He uses wordplay to use a different word, but give basically the same meaning, but he sharpens it up for us a little bit. And this is in 5:28. Your kingdom's been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Where do you think he picked up on the Medes and the Persians and their invasion? I've got to think it's Jeremiah 51:11 that's influenced him. Isaiah 13 may have influenced him. We don't have any explicit reference to Isaiah in Daniel's book, but this is Isaiah 13:17. I'll stir up the Medes against them. Speaking of an oracle there in Isaiah 13 against Babylon, I'll stir up the Medes against them. Daniel probably knew the prophets, don't you think? Don't you think Daniel probably knew the prophets? He already knows Jeremiah. What's to say that he didn't know Isaiah? In fact, his entire concern is about the Davidic monarchy. Don't you think that? Daniel chapters 2, 7, and the rest of the book He's concerned with the monarchy that's dropped out because of the exile. Now they're all asking the question, will the Davidic monarchy ever come back into play? Where do you think he might have picked up that the Davidic monarchy will come back into play? There's a reason that we've referred to Isaiah as something of the messianic prophet. He has something to say too, Isaiah does, about the Davidic monarch, the Davidic Messiah, coming at some time in the future after the exile. It doesn't tell us immediately after the exile, but sometime after the exile. Where do you think Daniel picked up on the fact that the Persians and the Medes were going to invade? Maybe Isaiah 13 was being read by him as well. And then we get into 529. Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple, put a necklace of gold about his neck, issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Well, Daniel's not going to bother too much with rejecting all of that. He knows that the kingdom is going to fall. He's just given an interpretation to this writing on the wall that says this kingdom's not going to last, right? Isn't that what he said? And then they still feel the need to give him this gold chain and this purple garb, and they give a proclamation throughout the whole kingdom saying, oh, he's third in command now. Don't you see that Daniel knows this isn't going to last but a few nights? This isn't going to last but an hour or two? Don't you know that Daniel knows this is futile? I think we do know that. Okay, that brings us to an end of chapter 5. But you're asking now about, well, what about 5, 30, and 31? The scholars, and when I say the scholars, and I don't make a distinction between some on this side and some on the other side of the aisle, they're unanimously agreed. Anybody who's credentialed in this field, the Old Testament that is, they know that 5, 30, and 31 are actually belonging to the start of chapter 6. 5, 30, and 31 begins a new segment. And so, let me tell you a problem that has come about in 5, 30, and 31 by failing to recognize this distinction. By looking at 5, 30, and 31 as its own thing, some have incorrectly, some who are very naive and uncredentialed, have broken 5 from chapter 6, 1 through 28. And then, of course, we've got this other text that I'll talk about here in just a moment. Chapters 9, well, let's just go 9 through 12. Chapters 9 through 12. And that's all sort of one oracle. We'll need to work with that when we get there. But 9 through 12 is one collective unit. To break that up is a mess. And people shouldn't do it. I read one fellow who takes a radical view, just bizarre view, where he starts splicing 9 through 12 up. That is horrendous. 9 through 12 is one block. It shouldn't be broken up. And those who do that don't know what they're doing with the book of Daniel. Okay, let's talk about then 5, 30, and 31 and why it belongs to chapter 6. By making these three different things, one fellow radically, I don't know another person who seriously takes his view, thinks that there are 3 Dariuses in the book of Daniel. You've got Darius here, the first Darius, you've got the second Darius talked about in chapter 6, and you've got a third Darius talked about in chapter 9. That is insane. I'm trying to be kind when I say this. That is an insane view. And the best thing to at least recognize that this is not a different fellow from this is by picking up the fact that all of the Hebrew scholars put 5, 30, and 31 right in with chapter 6. They put it right in with chapter 6. They know that 5:30 begins a new section. It's an unfortunate chapter division, I admit, but take a look at this. 5:30 begins a new section. Let's read it. That same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean, the king, was slain. And so, Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. In that night, Belshazzar the Chaldean was slain. Maybe it is talking about the night of the party. So it does maybe link back to chapter 5. But that still doesn't stop us from recognizing that it's a new section. That same night Belshazzar the Chaldean was slain. That's fine. But there's a new segment here. Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. It moves right into chapter 6, verse 1. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom. The only reason somebody would conclude that there's a different Darius in 531 from 6:1 is an unfortunate chapter division. You see that? It's the same Darius in 531 as in chapter 6. Now let's go ahead and read a couple of other things. It says in 6:1 through 3, 6:1 is sufficient. 6:1, Darius appointed 120 satraps over the kingdom. Some kind of official position, something like a president or an official, some kind of senator, something like that. He appointed 120 of those fellows over the kingdom. Over the kingdom. Then let's look at this in chapter 9. This is Daniel 9 and verse 1. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans, ... So, let's go ahead and list our facts then, what we know about Darius. And I'm going to make the assumption for the moment, and you're going to just go ahead and stomach that, I suppose. I'm going to make the assumption that there's only one Darius. I'll make an argument perhaps later as to why there's only one, but right now we're just going to assume that. Let's talk about what we know about this Darius fellow in the book of Daniel. The first thing is this. His descent is of Median descent. So says chapter 5 and verse 31, and also so says chapter 9 and verse 1. Darius the Mede. The second thing we know about Darius is that he is 62 years old at Persia's invasion. 62 years old during Persia's invasion. So says, chapter 5 and verse 31. The next thing we know about Darius, number 3, is that he is the son of Ahasuerus. And that's said in chapter 9 and verse 1. This Ahasuerus, it could be also named Xerxes, it looks like to me, that certain Ahasuerus, but tough to say. And then number 4, we know that he was over the Chaldeans. He was over the Babylonian, at least the Babylonian province, let's word it that way, and that's in 9:1. He was made king over the Chaldeans. These are the 4 facts that we know about Darius. There's not a whole lot more that we know about him in the book of Daniel. So if we're going to make an interpretation of who is this Darius, we need to make sense of all 4 of these facts. Now let me tell you why some have tried to divide this up. Some have tried to say one is Darius the Mede, and then we've got another fella down here in 9:1 who's Darius the Persian. That's not going to go. 9:1, he's not a Persian. 9:1 says he's a Mede. That's right here. 9:1 says he is also Darius the Mede. So whoever this Ahasuerus is, this Xerxes fella is, whoever that is, it still says in 9:1 that this same fellow is also a Mede. That is extremely pointing. That is extremely pointed at the fact that this is the same Darius in chapter 5 and in chapter 9. And if we recognize that 5 and 6 are not divorced from each other and that they're actually bridged together, we recognize the fact then that it's the same Darius in 5 and 6. So you've got the same Darius in 5 and 9. You've got the same Darius in 5 and 6. What does that tell you? One Darius in the book. That seems simplistic enough to me. The fact is, consistently in the book, he is a Mede. He is over the Chaldeans. That's also in 531. He is a fellow that's 62 years old during Persia's invasion. We need to look for somebody who fits the bill in all 4 areas here. And we can't divorce and make it 3 different characters. The book suggests nothing of the sort. Consistently, he's a Mede. Consistently, he's over Babylon. These other 2 remarks here are just sidelined as we recognize that consistently he's a Mede and over the province in Babylon. That is consistently the case. So we're not dealing with 3 different characters, one who's a Mede, one who's a Persian, and then some other fellow who's just a general or something like that. We need to recognize that all 4 of these things, if we take Daniel's text credibly and seriously, apply to one singular fellow. It's one singular Darius the Mede. Now let's go ahead and talk about then some possibilities. If we're going to try to identify who is Darius the Mede, what are some of the possibilities? One suggestion was that it was Cambyses, this son of Cyrus the Great. That doesn't look appropriate. Cambyses reigns from what? I think it's about 5. I think it was 530. You'd need to check me on this, but I'm pretty sure it's 530 to 522 where Cambyses reigns. This isn't early enough. Babylon falls in 539, right? 539 maybe to 536, somewhere in there. Cambyses is missing it. He's too late. 530 isn't close enough. A second possibility. Some have suggested, a lot of reputable scholars say that Cyrus is Darius. So Darius would just be another name for Cyrus. Now, we'll talk about 628 here in a moment. Daniel chapter 628 has something for us. But we need to examine that a little more closely. Let's just hold this in suspect for the moment, and I'll make some passing remarks here in a moment about chapter 9, 1, chapter 10, 1, and then 11, 1. And I want to talk about this. I'll come right back. I'll keep it on the screen for you. Another possibility, and here's where we're getting closer. There was a fellow on the Nabonidus Chronicle, whose name is Gobirus. Now, this is going to get tricky. And in translating from this, the translation was often given as Ugbaru. And so when we recognize that this is just another transliteration for that name Gobirus, we made the conclusion Ugbaru and whoever translated it thought that Ugbaru was the same fellow as Gobirus all the way through. There have been wonderful suggestions made by Whitcomb. He's the major fellow in this department, John Whitcomb, but he had help from D.J. Wiseman of the British Museum and a few others who helped him with it. Sidney Smith, I think was the name. And these fellows worked on this translation and recognized that Gobirus, there are two different fellows named Gobirus on the Nabonidus Chronicle. Two different fellows. And they recognized one is a general. Ugbaru is a general who dies 3 weeks after the siege of Babylon. He was a general of Cyrus the Great, Cyrus the Persian, but he dies only 3 weeks later. So most people had said, it can't be Ugbaru, can't be this general of Cyrus. He dies only 3 weeks later. Doesn't give us enough time for Daniel chapter 6 to happen. So obviously that's confused. And so a lot of people had just simply said, this whole thing is still up in the air. But Whitcomb and Wiseman and Smith, some of these fellows, did some other work, and they started recognizing on this chronicle, the Nabonidus Chronicle, Gobirus, there are two of them. One is Ugbaru. There is another fellow that we ought to transliterate his name or translate his name as Gubaru. And this, it looks like to me, is probably the Darius of the book of Daniel. You'd need to see the commentary where I make all of this a little bit more appealing. I even give you the translation of the Nabonidus Chronicle with some notes about it. You'd want to see all of this section on Darius the Mede in the introduction to the commentary. But it looks like to me that Gubaru is the most plausible. Now, he answers a couple of questions. Let's come back to this question about Cyrus equaling Darius. Now, remember, I'll just put off to the side here so you can see. I think that Gubaru of the Nabonidus Chronicle is Darius. That's my present conclusion. If more data surfaces, you could perhaps convince me otherwise. But for the moment, I think that Gubaru is the Darius of the book of Daniel. Now let's see if we can make some sense out of some of these things that are going on here with Cyrus and Darius. The first question is chapter 6, verse 28. Let's give that a read. This is Daniel 6:28. It says at the end of the narrative section of Daniel, it says in 6:28, so this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So some have read 6:28 to say that, well, that basically says that Darius and Cyrus are one and the same. I don't think so. And a number of folks don't think so either. In 6:28, it may not be that it's a synonym, that it's just another name for Cyrus. Darius is another name for Cyrus. It may be that it expresses co-regency. I think that's highly plausible. Gubaru then would be a second in command. Gubaru, Darius the Mede would be subject to, a co-regent to, Cyrus the Persian, Cyrus the Great. Now let's take a look at another thing. This is let's get chapter 9 and verse 1. This is chapter 9 and verse 1. And I need to say this at this point. 9 through 12 is one block. 9 through 12 is one block. So we have timestamps in 9:1, 10:1, and 11:1. And look at this. This is chapter 9 and verse 1 where it says, it was the first year of Darius. First year of Darius. But then go over to chapter 10. Chapter 10:1, if we treat all of this as one block, and we should, 9:1, 10:1, 10:1 says the third year of Cyrus. What do you think about that? What if Cyrus conquers Babylon in 539? So his third year would be something like 536. And what if the third year of Cyrus is equivalent to the first year of Darius, 536? Cyrus takes the throne. He becomes the world leader in 539. Something like 536 would be his third year. Looks like maybe to me the first year of Darius is 536, and he is a co-regent to Cyrus. What's his name? Probably Gubaru of the Nabonidus Chronicle. Then there's one more thing in 9:1. 9:1 says this. It says he was made king over the province of Babylon, over the kingdom of Babylon. What if Cyrus the Great, Cyrus the Persian, who's the world leader, appoints Gubaru, Darius, as the provincial king, the co-regent over the Babylonian province, over the Babylonian realm? Wouldn't that make sense with him being made king? I certainly think so. Now let's go back to chapter 5 then and read this one more time. This is 5:30. The same night Belshazzar the Chaldean was slain. Darius the Mede received the kingdom about the age of 62. It doesn't say, the text doesn't say that Darius received the kingdom in the very same night that Belshazzar died. Read that again. This is 5:31. Darius the Mede received the kingdom about the age of 62. It doesn't say that he received the kingdom in the night in which Belshazzar was slain. So maybe there was a time of 3 years where Cyrus had been on the throne in 539 at Belshazzar's death. In 536, Darius comes on the throne. Now let's talk about some of the questions. If we were to conclude that Gubaru is Darius, let's talk about some of the questions that are still unanswered. The first one is this. We have no record that Gubaru was ever called king. We have no record that Gubaru was ever called king. In the secular records, that is. We have no record of him being called king. He's some kind of second in command to Cyrus, but he's not ever termed king. The second is this. He's not in the secular literature or even in the book of Daniel. We don't see it explicitly said, Gubaru is Darius. So there's no evidence that this Gubaru fellow ever wore the name Darius. The third thing that we recognize is this. There is no record of his father. It says in 9:1 of Daniel, Ahasuerus, or maybe even another name is Xerxes, was the father of Darius of the book of Daniel. But we have no record as far as we know as of yet. There's been nothing found suggesting who Gubaru's father was. And then a fourth thing is this, his nationality. Mede, Persian, Chaldean? Don't know. His nationality is unknown. So, we've got a couple of things that really help us perhaps make sense of all of this. The kingdom was received. It does look like he was a co-regent to Cyrus. But we've got four things here that are in question. Gubaru's not called a king in secular literature. He's not given a name in secular literature as being named also as Darius. There's no record of his father, and his nationality is unknown. But there is something here that I document in the commentary that this view has going for it that I can't find another view also having, and that is this. No conflicts. There is an inner consistency about this view. As of yet, there's been nothing that I've found or some of the other fellows have found that contradicts the idea that Gubaru is also known as Darius of the book of Daniel. So at least it has that going for us. While we have maybe some questions that still nag at us and linger, we don't have any conflict where there's an inner consistency problem in the view. As of the moment, I think Gubaru as Darius is probably the most plausible view. And as we get into chapter 6 and then following, I think we'll see very clearly that it's the same Darius in the book the whole way through. That brings us to the end of Daniel chapter 5 and verse 31. We'll get into chapter 6 next time. If you've got other questions, especially or particularly on Darius the Mede, I've got this section here in the book. Let's see if I can tell you specifically what page here. It's the introduction, page 33. Page 33, starting over here on the side, I've got a whole section on Darius the Mede. It runs another couple of pages. Here's the translation. Right over here is the translation. that I was talking about, and I've got my notes all telling you about that. And it ends right here. So it's nothing too long, but it more or less gives a little bit more detail on some of those points that I brought out and gives you those references that maybe you want to look at and spend some more time on it. It's got a little bit more of an exposition there. If you're interested, pick a copy up from lulu.com. You can get it through my website, cadleonard.com. You can also watch these lectures through that website. I don't know if you're watching them on YouTube or through the website. But if you've got any other questions, comments, concerns, shoot me an email at drewleonard@live.com, and we'd be happy to assist in any way we can. God bless you. Have a good rest of your day.